This is Anya Leonard, the co-founder of Classical Wisdom, a website dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. And I'm very happy to say that today we have Professor James S. Romm, the Ottaway Jr. Professor of Classics and Director of the Classical Studies Program in Bard in New York. He is also the author of Dying Every Day, Seneca at the Court of Nero. So first off, thank you very much, James, for talking to me today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And perhaps the best place to start is if you could just give us a brief explanation and review both on Seneca and his thoughts on death.
Sure. So Seneca, the man we call Seneca is often called Seneca the Younger, to distinguish him from his father, who was also Seneca. But Seneca the Younger is an important Roman philosopher of the 1st century AD. He belonged to the Stoic school of philosophy, and we can get into what that means. He also had a very distinguished political career. Well, distinguished is one word, but some would call it infamous. He served the Emperor Nero, who was very young and needed an older advisor, and Seneca was his chief advisor and, in a sense, his chief of staff for about 10 years in the middle part of the 1st century AD, and met his death at the hands of Nero after their relationship had deteriorated. So that brings us to the topic of death, which was a crucial one for Seneca. And the title of my book, Dying Every Day, reflects that. He thought constantly about death. The Stoics were, of course, being philosophers, they were interested in death, but his interest was almost an obsession. And his position was that death is always present, always overshadowing human life. And we do our best to rehearse for it, to practice for it, and essentially live our whole lives with the goal of death in mind. So dying every day is his description of what human life is like. We're dying every day.
And Seneca was sort of famously exiled as well. Did that play quite a huge role in his Stoicism?
Well, not so much in his Stoicism, but in his political life, yes. He was exiled for about 8 years under Claudius, and brought back from exile, very much to his relief, at the end of Claudius's reign, when Claudius had already married Agrippina, the mother of Nero, and Agrippina was trying to manipulate the succession such that her son, and not Claudius's son, would succeed to the emperorship. So bringing Seneca back, appointing him to tutor to Nero, was a part of her strategy for promoting her son's interests, making it more likely that he would succeed after Claudius's death, which he did.
Yeah. And so Seneca, as you said, was sort of obsessed with death. What were some of his thoughts about it?
So all the philosophers who speculated about death looked back to the death of Socrates as described by Plato. And this was sort of the touchstone for moral philosophy, the poise and fearlessness with which Socrates met his death, and his statement at the end of the Phaedo, the dialogue Phaedo, that he owed a sacrifice to Asclepius, the god of healing, as though his death were a kind of healing of the illness of mortality. So that became the focal point for a lot of speculation about how we should regard death. And Seneca particularly was concerned with that. Socrates, of course, was a victim of political persecution. He met his death at the hands of the Athenian state. And in Seneca's time, that issue, the issue of political execution, was an even more pressing one, because the Roman emperors, the Principate, had the power of life and death over its citizens, and many of them had met their death hand over. So it was important to make a reckoning with death and to be prepared for it, and not to regard it as something to be feared or something to be dreaded, and to live one's life in the expectation that death could come at any moment.
Okay, due to poor connection from my end, I will turn off my video. So back to the question. For those of us who are not living in oppressive governments, which I hope includes all of our readers or listeners, how does learning or thinking about death help us in life?
Well, there is, of course, some differences in our relationship to death, since we don't encounter it nearly as often as Seneca and his class did. But on the other hand, we have developed a culture in which it's possible to avoid any contact with death. It's all done in hospice or in hospitals, away from our view and out of our, our consciousness. So Seneca thought that was a grave mistake, that we have to rehearse for death and we have to become accustomed to it in order not to fear it. The more we estrange ourselves from it, the more fearful it becomes, or fearsome, I should say. And of course, that's very much true for our culture.
I would even go further and say that in our current culture, we're separated from all of the extremes of life. Like, we're separated from death, we're separated from birth, we're separated from all sorts of sicknesses. I mean, I didn't experience a single birth until I gave birth. You can't imagine any society historically where that would have been the case.
Yes, that's right. And it's interesting you pair those two rites of passage, because for Seneca, they were very much a pair. We should be, in his view, we should be treating death as a natural part of life, just the same way we treat birth, marriage, coming of age, all the other rites of passage.
And so what does Seneca feel about suicide then, the non-natural type of entering of death, I suppose?
So Seneca has a lot of thoughts about suicide. They range widely, and he's often portrayed as an advocate of rational suicide, that is, the choice to end one's life when the circumstances make life no longer worth living. Not the kind of suicide we think of today in a state of distress or mental illness, but a considered choice that, for whatever reason, illness, pain, dementia, the remainder of life simply doesn't have enough to offer. He advocated that, and he, in a sense, he practiced it himself, because when the emperor demanded his suicide, he willingly took his own life. And it's important to recognize, again, the political context, that suicide in his day was often a means of political execution. Members of the aristocracy were asked to commit suicide rather than force the emperor to have them executed. And by doing that, they got to preserve their estate and hand it on to their heirs rather than have it confiscated. So there was sort of a reward for taking one's own life, essentially admitting guilt in whatever charge one was accused of, and sparing the emperor the trouble of having you killed. So his concern with suicide, again, is part of his political culture, maybe less relevant to us today, but still important. We have these right to death movements in various states. Some states have actually passed laws permitting the right to die, the right to suicide if one has reached a terminal stage of illness in which there's no hope of recovery. And more states are debating that. And it is still a pressing issue for us today.
Do you think that Seneca's suicide was quite romanticized, though? I mean, that the Romans definitely had a bit of a penchant for suicide, maybe more so than the Greeks. And, I know later accounts of Seneca's death are a bit more dramatic than maybe contemporary accounts.
Well, actually, the contemporary account of Tacitus, which is very detailed, is extremely dramatic because Seneca had to use 3 different methods. He tried first to slash his veins, and because he was sort of thin and emaciated, his blood didn't flow out fast enough. So he then tried to take hemlock, which is the same poison that Socrates used in his suicide. So Seneca was quite obviously trying to imitate Socrates there, but that failed also. And finally, he dragged himself into a steam-filled room and suffocated himself from the hot steam. So it's Tacitus describes it in a way that I could only call black comedy. It's you know, a man who had thought his whole life about suicide, and then when push came to shove, he kind of bungled it, but finally did succeed in taking his own life. The scene was portrayed by various Renaissance painters, including Rubens, and there are some very dramatic canvases, which, as you say, romanticize or dramatize his death as a kind of martyrdom. And I don't think that's how he wanted it to be seen. But by that time, you know, attitudes toward death had changed. And just like with the death of Socrates was portrayed by David, the moment of death is made the subject of pathos and tragedy.
Now, is it interesting that Seneca was so appreciated by thinkers in the Renaissance time period when I suppose the Christian values were very much against suicide? Why would they romanticize his death then?
Well, I think partly because he was a victim of Nero, and Nero, after all, made martyrs of the Christians as well as of Seneca. In fact, that he had Seneca killed, he allegedly also killed St. Peter and St. Paul. And the Renaissance believed that Seneca had been in correspondence with St. Paul. There was a set of letters, which are now regarded as spurious, that passed between the two of them and indicated that Seneca had a deep interest in Paul's philosophy. So the Renaissance saw him as sort of a proto-Christian. So this was another kind of crucifixion or martyrdom like that of Christ or Paul.
And so do you think that Seneca was a good Stoic? I mean, did he practice what he preached?
Well, that's a very good question. And I examine that question at length in my book, Dying Every Day. And I don't have firm conclusions because one can look at his writings and see him as a tireless advocate for Stoic values, a eloquent, almost a impassioned devotee of the life of reason and of virtuous action, the sources of happiness for the Stoic. But in his own political career, he was forced to collude in all kinds of atrocities, including Nero's murder of his mother and his brother and his wife. So you have this paradox, this almost schizophrenic life that doesn't lend itself to easy analysis. And I finally came down by saying that one has to come to one's own conclusions. One can see Seneca's character as half full or half empty.
Yeah, I mean, because he was clearly ambitious and concerned himself with wealth and things like that. But some of those other tenets that Stoics sort of push against, that his actions seem to be very contrary to some of his writings.
Yes, and he was a very wealthy man, as you say, and he took some grief from his contemporaries for owning a huge fortune while espousing Stoic values. Stoicism didn't preach against wealth. It wasn't evil. Money was simply indifferent. It didn't conduce either to happiness or unhappiness. But in some of his writings, Seneca does adopt a kind of a, mendicant sort of philosophy that one should divest oneself of wealth. It's just going to make you unhappy. But at the same time, he was getting fabulously rich. So there's the paradox. And it's really hard to know what to make of it.
I suppose it's in a sort of ironic way. Nero ordering him to commit suicide was a good thing for Seneca, because he ended up fulfilling a bit more of his role as being a Stoic in the final acts, and he could, in a nice old age, still be able to live his destiny as a death-obsessed Stoic.
Well, and one could say the same about Socrates. Socrates claimed it was a good thing for him to die at age 70, and he achieved an immortality that he never would have had if he just died in his bed as an older man. Seneca was about 65 and already feeling ill and worn out. He'd had lifelong respiratory illness, perhaps tuberculosis, and might not have lived much longer. So yes, this was a glorious way for him to go.
Yeah, I've often wondered that would Socrates have been so quite contrarian in court if he was a younger man and had a bit more to lose?
Yes, exactly right.
Not that you want to take away the romanticism of these, very brilliant thinkers, but at the same time, there's a little bit of realism probably. Anyways, to finish up then, could you let us know what you're working on at the moment?
I'm translating another set of passages from Seneca that deal with generosity. I have two sets of translations already in the series called Ancient Wisdom for Modern Readers from Princeton University Press. One is called How to Die, Seneca's Thoughts on Death. The other is called How to Keep Your Cool, which is about suppressing anger or overcoming anger. And this third volume will be about generosity, called How to Give. So Seneca wrote a very long essay called On Benefits, which deals with the subject of giving and receiving, and why it's essential to give in a generous frame of mind without expecting any return, what that means for society and for the individual, what it means in moral terms. It's in some ways his most profound work, his longest work. So that will be coming out next spring.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I look forward to it, and I'll put down all of those links to the other books below for any listeners if they want to check them out. And I want to just say thank you again, James, for talking with me here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.